Burgers and fries and cherry pies, it was simple and good back then. Walking in the sand, hand in hand, never thinking that it could end.
I am honored to introduce Joshua Lohnes. Josh Lohnes was raised in Europe and moved to the United States for his university studies. He graduated with an international business degree from San Diego State University, and after a short stint in corporate sales, transitioned to international development work in the Central African Republic and Egypt, with a focus on micro-enterprise development and ecotourism. He translated that expertise into refugee resettlement work in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he provided employment, small business development, and agricultural services to new Americans from Iraq, Bhutan, Burma, Burundi, and other places. He moved to Morgantown to pursue a master's degree on the politics of water in the Sinai Desert, a passion project cut short by a growing family and the fallout from the Arab Spring. In 2013, he began work developing West Virginia Food Link, an action research project that develops planning resources, data sharing tools, and curricula in support of local and regional food policy coalitions. This work also served as the basis for his dissertation on the political economy of food banking networks in the United States, titled The Food Bank Fix: Hunger, Capitalism, and Humanitarian Reason. Josh has been involved in a number of local food-related projects in West Virginia, including Conscious Harvest Cooperative, a gardening collective working with local anti-hunger organizations to close food access gaps in Monongalia County. He is also a founding member of First Hand Coffee, a multi-stakeholder cooperative working to provide educational opportunities for students to engage with ethical supply chains and alternative economies at home and abroad. He also served for 2 years on the board of Mountain People's Food Co-op in Morgantown. He currently directs the work of the Food Justice Lab at the WVU Center for Resilient Communities, where he continues to study the moral, political, and economic place of food in the wider economy and support the development of food policy and anti-hunger coalitions in West Virginia and beyond. Welcome, Josh. Thank you.
So today we're here to talk about the food justice exhibit that WVU Libraries is planning next fall. And Sally invited me to consult on this as part of some of the work I've been involved in with the WVU Food Justice Lab out of the Geography Department. And today I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of what is food justice. It's a very broad and complex social movement that recognizes trauma and inequity in the food system, and recognizes that this trauma did not happen overnight, that there have been kind of dynamics coded in historical processes that are reinforcing this. And the food justice movement is working to confront the power relationships that created the conditions for this inequity. It focuses heavily on race, class, and gender privilege and trying to undo that. But the food justice movement, because it's broad, is also very splintered, right? We have folks involved in local ag that will claim the food justice mantle, organics, anti-hunger, charitable food networks might claim to be doing food justice work as well, those working on food environments and our food landscapes, fair trade organizations that are trying to create more equity between producers and consumers. But we also need to attend to the more radical parts of this movement that are really at its core, which are around racial justice, the erasure of indigenous foodways and ways of life more generally, land rights, and the unequal access to land and in private property relations around land, gender equity, who is responsible for ensuring that people are fed in the household. Most of that burden falls on women, right? And a lot of the care work around ensuring that people are fed, the burden falls on women. Labor and migrant rights is another huge part of the food justice movement. So I have a half hour to kind of give some broad brushstrokes about potential themes for contribution to art. And I'm going to do my best to do that by looking at some historical dynamics that we need to pay attention to, kind of an analysis of where power currently lies in our food system, and some of the initiatives in West Virginia that are unfolding to confront this. So we can't talk about food without talking about settler colonialism and kind of the dispossession of lands and the erasure of indigenous ways of provisioning food. There's also been a lot of appropriation, right, around cultural foodways. So things like, food items like maple syrup, we learned how to do that from the people that we encountered, seeds and the great ecological exchange that happened in the 1700s with seeds that were cultivated here for millennia, but that have mostly been erased and whitewashed. So we need to contend with histories of settler colonialism and the land relationships, the labor relationships that ensued out of that. We can't talk about food justice without talking about the plantation system, slavery, racism, and kind of the dynamics that really led to the early signs of some of the injustices that we continue to confront. So sugar as a commodity was highly valued in relationship to the emergence of industrial capitalism in Northern Europe. And these plantations directly served to feed cheap calories to peasants that were kicked off their land and ended up in low-wage factory work. So there's a relationship between the emergence of injustices in our food system and contemporary economic systems as well. And so all of these logics around the plantation system, monocultures, et cetera, still express themselves, right, within our contemporary agro-industrial food system. And food justice works to make those links explicit, to say, hey, we're part of an ongoing 400-year experiment in the way that we produce, distribute, and consume food that is coded with some deep injustices that need to be repaired. So food and white supremacy is a potential theme, right, that artists might want to confront in this exhibit. And looking at, the history of food in the United States and relations to white supremacy, we also need to go back to Abraham Lincoln. And he, is best known for the Emancipation Proclamation. Out of that, there were a whole bunch of false promises around reparations to former slaves, that they would have access to land. So, the social contest in that era around food and land access and sovereignty was really intense. But one thing that we don't remember Abraham Lincoln for as much is that he founded the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He was a pioneer settler, right, on the U.S. frontier, and founded the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and in this opening speech said this would be the People's Department because it would affect the lives of every single American. And indeed, it still does. The WVU extension and the land grant university system also emerged in this era, really to increase agricultural productivity and to increase yields. And that was highly successful. Productivity exploded, but it exploded in a way that kind of broke a moral contract with consumers and our relationship to the land. So just 50 years later, we see this massive ecological disaster with the Dust Bowl, that some of the incentives of the US Department of Agriculture created, right? In the lack of recognition of land stewardship in the Great Plains that really affected the entire country at the very same time that we had a massive financial crisis, and more people had migrated into cities for work. And all of a sudden there was a situation where in the 1930s, farmers were not able to sell their product and consumers didn't have enough money to buy it. So the federal government stepped in and kind of reconciled this problem of bread lines knee deep in wheat. And all of those dynamics continue today, right? This hidden crisis of surplus in our food system and the production of scarcity in our food system is something that we need to contend with. And hopefully some artists might be interested in creating work based on. In the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement really made massive advances in nutrition entitlement. And the food justice movement really focuses on Black social movements during that time, specifically the Black Panthers Free Breakfast Program, which was very radical, right? And it was popping up all over the country in Oakland and Chicago, and pretty much saying like, our children are too hungry to learn in school, and we are going to create networks to feed them ourselves before they go to school. And it kind of highlighted the failure of the federal government to equitably provision enough food for its citizens. And that program actually became the basis for the free breakfast program that we now have in the USDA. So we can see how social movements and demands for equity and rights have influenced federal food policy over time, but there's still a long ways to go. At the same time, in the 70s, we saw the rise of the WTO and these global trade networks, and the erosion of rules around trade in food, and what's this so-called green revolution that uses technological investments and irrigation and chemical fertilizers and pesticides to, yes, produce more food, but that is actually creating conditions for injustice in the food system. In the 1980s, we saw even further erosion of food safety nets, corporate tax relief, and Reagan cut into welfare, and feeding lines formed, and that was the basis for now the food banking economy that has institutionalized across the US for over 50 million people that are now accessing food through mobile food pantries or food pantries simply because their wages aren't high enough to exchange money for food. So we're seeing a trend with a differentiation of foodways, right? Some have the privilege to go to a farmer's market or to a Whole Foods, while others can't afford enough food and have to wait in line at a food pantry. This trend of the paradox of hunger alongside agricultural productivity gains has really showed its ugly face during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I think we all, were made highly aware of the brokenness of a food system that was supposedly looking for efficiencies, but that actually exposed these essential workers that are working in fields and in meat processing plants it exposed us all to the horrid working conditions. But also this contradiction between surplus and scarcity that I was talking about earlier. So there's a brief overview of the, some of the historical roots that this food justice movement tries to confront and contend with. But the movement itself can trace its roots back to the environmental justice movement in the 1970s. And theoretically, from the academic side, that's really where it finds a lot of its thinking. And so when we talk about food justice, we need to be talking about distributive justice, right? Why is it that minority and poor communities bear the brunt of the burdens in our food system? And is there equal distribution of benefits from the food system, or are a small group of people benefiting from the status quo? And then we need to talk about procedural justice. So who is making decisions? Planning decisions about where Dollar General goes, or planning decisions about why a Kroger might disappear in a community. How are disputes resolved? Who is at the table making decisions about our food system? And do we actually have democracy left in our food system, right? Can we choose the future of our foodways or not? So to understand, this erosion of democracy and how do we confront power, we need to understand where power lies in the food system and, its relationship to distributive and procedural justice. So this funnel is kind of a way to visualize where power lies in the food system. At the top, we have inputs, and at the bottom, we have consumers. So this is kind of the agro-food supply chain, if you will, that I'm going to go over. And the smaller the line, the more concentration of power there is there. So today in the United States, we have about 10 to 20 dominant input suppliers. That's seeds, fertilizers, implements for farming, and they control a massive amount of market share and are thus able to influence price, influence production practices, and this is actually consolidating even further. Just last year, Monsanto and Bayer, two of a chemical corporation and a GMO seed company, merged, and so we're starting to see conversations around breaking up antitrust laws around food monopolies, just because the power of these groups has become so massive to dictate, what is an everyday essential life-bearing commodity in food. So that's where most of the power lies, but then we have massive consolidation also happening in a very few corporations. And while it may look like we have a lot of diversity when we walk into a Walmart or a Kroger, there's a variety of foods, but when you really track the supply chains and the corporate ownership of these different brands, there's more and more and more consolidation. And these groups can then influence price points and drive prices down, basically. So it makes it very difficult for farmers to keep up without then engaging in these environmentally destructive or exploitative labor practices. There's about 32,500 food wholesalers and 112,000 retailers that control how we access food in this country. And out of those, the top four, Walmart, Kroger, Costco, and Target, and now we actually have to add Aldi to that list because they overtook Target, control 50% of all grocery sales. It's a massive amount, right? WVU Dining Services was recently privatized and put into the hands of a private company, a French company called Sodexo, right? This is another very powerful player in the food system that we need to be thinking about in relationship to food justice. So next we have farms, right? And farmers get a lot of slack, but they're often at the mercy of these other third-party actors that are dictating price. And there is a massive imbalance in who owns farmland, right? I mean, 96% of farmland in the US is owned by white folks. So there is a distributive injustice in terms of land allocation. And a lot of that land is under, monocrop production. And those farmers then are also hiring labor that is not justly compensated, that doesn't necessarily have good worker protection laws. And so we need to also be looking at dynamics at the site of production, which is the farm, and the sites of food processing, right? These CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations that create massive environmental pollution, and also the work environments in those factories for meat processing. So again, food justice is this very broad issue that can touch on a whole bunch of different topics. But I think one interesting one for me is the erosion of this moral contract between producers and consumers, and who has captured that moral contract, right? We have now states and governments involved, corporations are involved, private foundations, nonprofits, workers, consumers. There's this whole host of dynamics that are at work in our food system, trying to determine, like, what is its future going to be, right? How did we get here, and where are we going? And a key issue as a part of that moral contract right now is also our planet, right, and the environment. I mean, our food production, current food production and distribution system, because we are trucking and shipping food all across the world, is contributing significantly to climate change. So this moral contract is being contested. This is the disbursements under the Farm Bill that gets negotiated every few years. What's surprising to most is that over 3/4 of it is actually going to nutrition assistance programming. So there still is this link that was formed in the 1930s between creating a food system that produces a lot of food, but also the needs of a population that has difficulties being self-sufficient without government aid. So nutrition is tied to production in the Farm Bill, and we need to continue to ask, how is that moral contract working itself out? Who is benefiting from these nutrition assistance dollars? Is it only consumers, or who is actually lobbying to keep those in place? And when you look at the Farm Bill and the returns on lobbying, the return on investment is massive. So we hear a lot about big oil, right? There's about a 5,900% return for every dollar invested. Exxon and those folks get about $59 back. For corporate lobbying for food, it is $144 for every dollar invested on Capitol Hill. So I think, we need to be paying attention to this. Who is influencing our laws? Who is shaping them? And how does that then contribute to injustices in our food system? And then there's us, right? 300+ million consumers that can't quite get our act together to demand social change. And this is, in a sense, where power should lie in a democracy, but where currently very little of it is expressed in our food system. But food justice is also about food democracy and food sovereignty, which I'll talk about a little bit later. since this is a theme about food justice in Appalachia, I think we really need to contend with massive food access problems in this region. It's a region with high rates of poverty. It's also a rural region, right? And so how are people accessing food in Appalachia? And what are the dynamics that lead to that differentiated food access? Food Justice Lab has done a lot of work on food accessibility, and a map we developed in 2017 around the retail environment in our state looked at, what types of stores exist at the census block scale, and what's the level of poverty there, what's the level of access to a vehicle. And you can see this hodgepodge of colors. And the problem isn't necessarily that this map isn't all green. The problem is that there is some green and some red, right? It would ideally be all orange if equity was actually present in our food environments from a retail perspective, right? But then there's all of these other food access strategies that people use and encounter. So state entitlements is a huge one, right? SNAP, WIC, programs for women's, infants, and children, the National School Lunch Program, which we would, Sally and I are working on trying to see if we could get art teachers across the state to have K through 12 students submit their experiences with nutrition assistance and food access during the COVID-19 pandemic. Charitable food access is a expanding mode for folks to access food in West Virginia. And we need to really be asking what is the relationship between these charitable food networks and power in the food system that I went over earlier. We have issues of health disparities, right, around malnutrition and obesity that are linked to these power dynamics as well. And even though only about 2 or 3% of the workforce in the United States works in the farm sector, there is a huge workforce working in the food service sector, preparing, processing food for us, transporting food, and these folks are paid very, very, very low wages. So part of the food justice movement over the past few years has been the Fight for 15, ensuring that those that provision food on our behalf are justly compensated for that essential work. And, again, COVID-19 has revealed the essential function that these folks play in our everyday lives. And we need to start asking ourselves, why aren't we compensating them adequately? And then finally, there's a whole movement emerging around community food security, which is, the ability for a community to come together and address food insecurity by linking up with local and regional food movements. There is a whole bunch of experimentation happening right now across West Virginia with our family nutrition program at WVU Extension. The Turnrow Appalachian Farm Collective is organizing farmers into a food hub to be able to sell into institutions like schools and even food banks. And we're seeing mobile markets pop up. We're seeing community gardens pop up. How, farmers markets, how are these interrelated to one another? And what is the actual conversation happening at this grassroots level about confronting power? The critique of these movements is that they're often white-led, that they represent a certain agrarian imaginary that never quite existed, and that we need to widen the space of actors that can get involved in community food security work. So we have developed the Nourishing Networks curriculum on our FoodLink website, which I encourage anybody interested in this topic to visit. There's about 11 short videos that talk about these dynamics around food access. You know, and they are intersectional and multi-pronged. People might fail to access food for a variety of reasons, right? There might be a crisis in their life, a death, a disaster, a car that breaks down, a job loss, lack of income, identity issues around gender, race, age, disability, you know, knowledge about how to even go to the DHHR office and apply for SNAP, where you live. So we kind of break these down, and anybody interested in submitting an art piece, but that doesn't quite have an idea of what theme they want to explore, I would encourage you to go and explore this curriculum, because it asks a few questions to consider. And then on the strategies front, you know, how are people accessing food right now? How much are they leveraging state nutrition assistance dollars? How much is food charity a part of their lives? Where does farming fit in self-provisioning, hunting, gardening? And what is our food retail environment like? You know, I mean, I'm sure many of you have noticed the takeover of Dollar General across our food landscape and the disappearance of a lot of mom and pop shops that just can no longer compete. We're seeing some major crises around grocery stores closing down and leaving communities without an alternative, needing to drive 10 or 20 miles to access fresh food. So these are issues that artists might want to take up, and I'm also open to talking to anybody about this going forward. So what I like about my involvement in this project is that art is also a means to synthesize ideas, right? And food justice is a very, very broad topic and theme, but art also has a particular way of confronting power. And I'm excited to see how these submissions end up doing that, and talking about, you know, lived experiences of the food system, histories that are perhaps no longer present, but that need to be reclaimed, and then what food futures we're building together. And to that, I would encourage anybody interested in food futures to explore the food sovereignty movement, which is a critique of the commodification of food. And what we mean by that is that food has been turned into something to buy and sell, and been divorced from all of the other meaning that food brings to a community, to a household, the cultures around food. When we reduce food simply to a commodity, it opens up pathways to these injustices and elevating food for profit over food for people, right? And food sovereignty is actually a peasant movement that emerged in the global South as these large Western agro-industrial supply chains were looking voraciously for new lands and new ways to create efficiencies in their supply chains. They were displacing peasants that had been on the land for centuries that could no longer have viable ways of life. So in 2007, peasant movements from across the world met in Mali in a place called Nyeleni to draft a food sovereignty declaration. And that declaration reads, "Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations." And there is an emergent and robust US food sovereignty alliance, and emergent work in West Virginia to try and strengthen the food sovereignty movement here. To that end, I'd also encourage you all to check out the West Virginia Food for All coalition and campaign. In November, we put on a series of workshops that had storytelling, had some presentations like this one on why it's difficult to achieve the right to food and ecologically sustainable food systems, but why it's also imperative and how we build coalitions for that moving forward. And I'm going to just end this presentation on what I hope will be a good summary video to help us into the next 20 minutes of Q&A around food justice in Appalachia and yeah, how this exhibit might unfold.
I think food justice people are really ready to dig in the dirt, if that makes any sense, and kind of get at the questions that we've been afraid to answer.
The food appears innocent, but what I argue, and along with many others, is that it's the product of legacies of violence and erasure and enslavement, and we need to talk about those stories too.
There are lots of folks who work very hard to put the food on our table, and as LaDonna Redmond says, there's never been a just, equitable food system, and so somebody is winning and somebody loses, and it's unfortunate that it's the labor.
And really thinking about the food system as colonial and as a tool for colonization and thus oppression, but also therefore thinking about food and agriculture as a tool for liberation and decolonization.
I think there's a lot of energy around food justice. I think particularly thinking about vertical integration of how do we link up struggles around food justice and racial disparities, thinking about the ways that race has become more and more a prominent aspect of the ways that we think about food systems and racialization, and how do we confront current and past injustices.
For us, some of the energy around the food justice, it's this intersection between farm viability and access or equity, so that it's not only people with more disposable income that can afford, locally produced products.
And that's what gives me hope, that young people are sort of saying, okay, older generation, we understand the barriers that stood between you and your neighbors, and we don't want to replicate that. And instead of a myopic view of what justice looks like, there's a more inclusive view, and youth are sort of trying to bring in all those different conversations for a more full conversation on what equity should look like.
Thank you, Joshua. That was an excellent presentation. And we have several questions already. Thank you, Hallie, and your class. I'm going to try to scroll up here to do the first question. First question, how can we best understand Appalachia's relationship with unhealthy food and resulting health consequences, obesity, etc.? Is this
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Is this a further injustice? Why do we see acutely subpar nutrition and expectations in our region? Did you get that?
Is that the first question in the chat?
Yes, Hallie. Do you want me to repeat it or do you see it?
Yeah, no, I see it.
Okay.
Thank you for that question, Hallie. Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at when this unhealthy food and this crisis of healthy food access emerged, it's not always been this way, right? And there are links between the way that our food environments are structured, and that by that I mean where in the environment can I access food, and what types of food can I access there, and our food system, or so for example, if I live in rural West Virginia and I don't have very much money, I perhaps work 2 part-time jobs, just making the rent and paying my electric and phone bills and enough gas money. I am dependent on the government benefits on my SNAP card to source food, and the 3 closest stores to me don't have any fresh produce. That's going to be an issue, right? And then we need to be looking at like, well, what are the conditions that led to there no longer being a store there offering fresh produce? I don't think I'm answering your question very well, and I apologize. I'm a little bit frazzled still from my my crazy run across town.
Thank you. All right, next question. Why is it that we see an increase in both waste and hunger levels? It seems that in recent years, stores are less willing to donate products and more likely to throw away. How do we encourage systems where businesses will donate unused food?
So actually, businesses donate a massive amounts of food into our food banking networks, and they're incentivized to do so through the tax code. Last or 2 years ago, corporations wrote off about $2.2 billion in tax credits for their food donations. But the issue, I think, is like, will a food donation from Walmart or will a food donation from Kellogg actually address the underlying root causes of hunger? Or is it just a Band-Aid? The production of food waste and these systems that I laid out around the commodification of food, where we just produce food to make money. So you're just going to continually produce more and more and more and more and more food. And the market mechanisms that structure our foodways incentivize farmers and processors and everybody down the chain to produce more to mitigate risk, right? So there's a problem in the way that our laws and incentives are structured that actually produces food waste. And then there's a problem around on the consumption side where we don't have adequate social safety nets for a huge proportion of people to access food. So there's this idea that, oh, why don't we just take the food waste and give it over to the hungry? Won't that solve this problem? Well, for the past 40 years, we've been trying to do that. And all we've seen is the food banking economy explode and more people relying on short-term donations that don't actually make their households food secure, right? There's no long-term security in that. So I think when we think about food waste and hunger, we need to be complicating that narrative a little bit and asking, who is actually benefiting from those donations, because the gift often has a lot of strings attached to it, and strings that are linked up to the power dynamics that I went over in the funnel.
Thank you. And then another from Hallie's class. Obesity is a real problem in West Virginia. What do you think we as people can do to help make this problem go away and to help those that suffer from obesity?
Absolutely. I think that we need to, step back from the personal responsibility of obesity. For one, there's a lot of intervention at the level of the individual, saying you need to reform yourself in order to not be obese, and much less looking at the systems that are creating the conditions for malnutrition, because obesity in many ways is a problem of malnutrition. And why is it that cheap calories are more accessible than nutritious foods. Like we have all of the tools that we would need to support a food system that makes nutritious foods affordable, available, but instead we have a system where it's very easy to access foods that lead to malnutrition. And WVU Extension and the SNAP-Ed program are doing a lot of work around this. And yeah, I would encourage you to look at the Family Nutrition Program website, and Take Back Our Health website as well, which was developed with WVU Extension and some other state institutions around asking these very questions, like what are the interventions, at what scale should they happen, and I can put that in the link as well in the chat.
Thanks. And then another question here. What steps can be taken to make grocers operate more fairly? What stops grocery stores with a high proportion of food stamp users from inflating prices? Are those receiving TANF benefits paying more? How do grocers set prices? That's kind of a lot of questions. Did you get all that?
Yeah, this is a huge question, and one that I think is really important to ask around our grocery landscapes, right? Who is making these siting decisions around the grocery stores that exist? Often they're made in corporate boardrooms very, very far away. And there's not much of a democratic process as to whether a Walmart is going to come into town or a Dollar General, and what that might do to the viability of local grocers. And, the power that these grocery stores also have to disappear, right? So what we saw a few years ago is in McDowell County, for example, a Walmart came into town. Other small businesses had difficulty competing. They all shut their doors. And then the Walmart board of directors or whoever makes those decisions deemed that store was no longer profitable enough. And they made an announcement they were going to shut it down, and 2 weeks later it was gone. And there was no democratic decision making around that, even though Walmart benefits significantly from SNAP, which is a government program, which is public money, right? And so would it be possible to create laws that say, hey, any grocery store that takes public money for nutrition assistance needs to ensure help to ensure a viable alternative before it leaves, or something like this. So there, I think we're really exploring the relationship between federal nutrition subsidies and retail food stores and what can happen there. Really interesting programs are emerging around doubling or even tripling the amount of SNAP dollars that low-income families can redeem through farmers markets or locally owned grocers. So the idea is if I go to the farmers market and spend $30 worth of SNAP, I can actually buy $60 worth of produce. And that incentivizes low-income families to spend their nutrition assistance dollars in the local economy, keeps those monies circulating in our regional food system. And we're exploring, like, is it possible to scale that up to say any West Virginia grown produce can be redeemed even at a corner grocery store, right? With this model. But it's very complex because these systems are are complex. They're designed at the federal level. They come down through the state, and the state administrates SNAP. So it's some long-term work for sure.
Awesome, thank you. And another question here, how come food security hasn't been brought up more? For a lot of people in West Virginia, this is a foreign term to them, or they may know what it is, just with different wording. I believe it's a true issue, but why isn't it talked about more?
I don't know, that's interesting. I feel like in the circles I run in, food insecurity is talked about quite a bit. And more people are getting frustrated with you know, the difficulties that they have accessing food, even, you know, working 2 jobs, for example, and still struggling to put food on the table. There's this thing called the cliff effect, where if you're on a federal SNAP program, for example, and you just make a little bit more money, like you get a 50-cent per hour raise, then it'll kick you off SNAP entirely. And a lot of families are caught up in this cycle of kind of never being able to get ahead. And a lot of the work that I'm doing with the Food for All Coalition is directly addressing this issue of food insecurity in our communities. So many communities across our state also have food pantries, right? Churches and other faith-based groups, nonprofits are putting in a whole bunch of resources to make sure that their neighbors have food. And you're right that this is, you know, probably not part of mainstream discourse as much as it should be, but I see it percolating up more and more. So I hope that that answers your question.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Thank you all very much for attending, and thank you, Josh. That was amazing, and thanks for answering all the questions. Very important work happening here. So thank you all. Anything else, Joshua?
No, thanks everyone for coming. I look forward to seeing the submissions and continuing to accompany the libraries as they curate this exhibit.
Yes, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.